And in the Sky News Centre, Bruce Hawker from Campaigns and Communications. Now, I just want to go through the other polls that did come out this morning. News poll, first of all. We'll run through some of the numbers here because this news poll is where we've seen the most dramatic change. The primary vote has seen a lift of 3 points for Labor to 36%, and the coalition down 5 points, now at 41%. After preferences, it washes out at a 50-50 split, so a 10-point gap that was there 2 weeks ago erased. On preferred Prime Minister, Julia Gillard has lifted 7 points to 46 against Tony Abbot's 32. Let's look at the Nielsen poll in Fairfax Papers today. It's not as good for Labor, but still we've seen an improvement in Labor's primary vote, now at 34% to the coalition's 45%. After preferences, 53-47, so a 6-point difference. Most interesting in the Nielsen poll, though, is the former leaders and the nostalgia that's there in the electorate for both Kevin Rudd and Malcolm Turnbull. Kevin Rudd versus Tony Abbott would see, if they put him in, Labor's primary vote lift to 44 in front of the coalition, and also after preferences. And Tony Abbott versus Malcolm Turnbull, well, clearly Malcolm Turnbull is still far more popular, not just amongst the wider electorate, where he's twice as popular, but amongst coalition voters as well. He's now more popular. Grahame Morris, what do you make of these polls today?
Politicians don't follow polls. Look, you're quite right in your intro. These ones are quite dramatic changes. And I think, you know, I think you can actually ignore the polls, but everyone ought to accept that in the last month things have changed. And the gap has closed, as we all thought they would, and we're essentially 12 months, almost to the day, out from an election campaign. And things have closed. Some of the polls are a bit fluffy. You know, we used to have a sample of 2,000, we're down to 1,000, the Greens are going up and down, preferences are all over the place. But there's also a conjunction of things in the last couple of weeks. One, the Prime Minister's been overseas a bit. Two, and was out of action. Two, her dad died. Three, we had the Campbell-Newman and the Barry O'Farrell, the two premiers, having to fix up Labor's mess in the two states. And you know, that sort of conjunction is not going to happen every month. But it's certainly...
Do you reckon that was an issue?
And somebody from the Labor Party has remembered something that they forgot for 35 years but has now remembered it again. Those things are not going to happen each month, but they have helped the Prime Minister, and strangely, none of it has anything to do with the Federal Labor Party or the Prime Minister. But the conjunction, I think, has affected the climate out there, and it's on top of a bit of an easing of the pressure on the government. So things have changed. We're back to somewhere near normal. Okay. So we should be.
All right, we'll get into some of that in a minute. But Bruce, what's your general take on what we've seen in the polls?
Not dissimilar from Graham's. I think there's been something of a perfect storm of issues recently which have served to help Labor and certainly hinder Tony Abbott in particular. But I think in addition to, you know, the very aggressive actions of state Liberal premiers in Queensland and New South Wales, we have seen, I think, a more nuanced approach to policy development by Labor in recent months, and I, you know, reference particularly the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the dental program, and Gonski as evidence of Labor focusing on what would be its real strength areas, the core Labor sort of values that people look to. So I think all these things have combined in a way that have seen this quite remarkable turnaround for the government in the last polls.
The other interpretation on this is that the carbon tax scare campaign is falling a bit flat now. It's been a lived reality for nearly 3 months. Grahame, do you think this has become a less important issue?
Yeah, I do. The mum and dads were really worried out there, and it was all over the front pages. When it came in, a bit of that pressure eased and a bit of the front pages changed. So, yeah, you know, we always sort of knew that it was going to come off the boil a bit. But there will be other issues come up. And the interesting thing, I think Bruce is sort of right, the Labor Party has tried to get a few more policy ideas out there, but they haven't got any money. And they cannot have 12 months of promising new things. Whereas Tony Abbott everything he says on policy as we get closer to the election is going to be fresh. It's going to be new. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be front page news. And the Labor Party is going to be struggling to match that. If you're running the perfect opposition campaign, and I think Tony Abbott has actually done it brilliantly, but you could argue that maybe around January and somewhere around June, a couple of really, really big set-piece speeches could have been useful. But at the time you were sort of heading towards that, there were things happened like in Afghanistan, some of our allies started shooting our own troops and whatnot. It was just sort of the wrong time to do it, as it turned out.
But do you think it's now time to start doing that?
Well, I work backwards. We are 12 months out from an election campaign. Everything, in my mind, in a campaign is back-ended, so you work backwards. But, look, I know there's a fair bit of work being done on this, but there'll be a few set-piece things to ease the pressure and give people more of a feel of what Tony believes in, and that'd be good.
Bruce?
Well, on that, I mean, I think it's really interesting that what we are seeing here is a very dramatic drop in Tony Abbott support. If I was him, I'd be getting some of those headland speeches and policy announcements out pretty soon, because I think in many ways the great appeal that Tony Abbott has had to his own people is that he's been able to drive Labor's vote down, and he's done it, I think, consciously knowing that it was going to drive his vote down as well. But now we've seen two things happening: Labor's vote going up, Liberals' vote going down, and his personal vote continuing to go down even further. So I'd be worried about that if I were in the Abbott camp. And I think we've just seen in the last week or so Joe Hockey supporters starting to put dip their toe in the water. We saw quite a laudatory piece in the Australian Financial Review by one of its columnists the other day, likening him to Clinton in certain respects, something which has always eluded me, but apparently not to others. So I think we are seeing, I suspect, a period of some turbulence for Tony Abbott. And
we'll talk about that in a minute. What about on the Labor side? Julia Gillard back in the game, according to the news poll, but in the Nielsen poll, when you do the hypothetical of returning to Kevin Rudd, Labor would do even better. What do you think the sum total of all of this is as far as any return to Kevin Rudd goes?
Are you asking me that? I think he's made it clear all along that he's not putting his hand up for it. That poll we saw in the AC Nielsen was pretty similar to what we saw a few months ago. I think that just tends to be where people's heads are at with regard to Kevin Rudd. It's not where the caucus's head is at, and that's what counts, as we know.
Yeah, I mean, you use the language that he's not putting his hand up, and he has ruled out another challenge, but do you think we would get to a point now or not where the caucus is going to want him back?
Well, I think the only circumstances in which that would happen would be if, Labor really plummeted badly, and right now they're going very well. So I don't anticipate that happening. But, it's very hard to predict any of these things at the moment, because the nature of politics at the moment is very unusual. I mean, we've never seen an opposition leader, I think, in modern times who's been so effective and so negative, but yet now is finding it so hard to really get any credibility in the electorate.
Graham, we'll get to Tony Abbott in a minute, but Kevin Rudd, what do you reckon? Is it all over now, or do you think there's still a glimmer of hope?
I think the collateral damage from the polls in the last month is Kevin Rudd. I don't think there's too much doubt the electorate wants Kevin back. If ask the electorate, Julia Gillard, Kevin wins by a long way, and it would be a really exciting election with him back as Labor leader. But his colleagues don't want him. And it must, you could understand, I think, that Kevin Rudd is still in the Parliament because he thought that the Prime Minister would not lift the Labor vote much, and that the colleagues will ultimately come to him and say, look, we're in an awful pickle, come and save us, mate. You did it last time, do it again. He must be sort of having a look at over his cornflakes and his toast and Vegemite and saying, do I really want to do this? Wouldn't it be nice to be our ambassador in China or in Washington? Some nice job for him. But the Labor Party obviously can't afford for him to go because you're going to an awkward by-election.
Yeah, that's right. Now, what about on the Liberal side? Malcolm Turnbull is far more popular than Tony Abbott, according to the Nielsen poll and others. Does that matter a jot? What do you think?
Well, on the coalition side, it doesn't. It doesn't. But I'll tell you what you could make a case for. Look, Malcolm is still playing an enormous role. Kevin isn't on the Labor side, but Malcolm is playing an important role. But you could make a case that with a slight adjustment in giving him, productivity, then that gets Malcolm, who's a very effective communicator and a very good politician, gets him into that sort of economic game. So, Abbott, Rob, Hockey, Malcolm, all in that economic game. And I think it is one of the things about the premiers is that all of a sudden, can Labor manage things or do they make a mess of things, is to the fore again. No. And it's a bit awkward and the Libs had to fix it up. But I think the economic game is back front and centre again.
Bruce, we're nearly out of time, but just finally, I did want to get you to respond to something Julie Bishop was saying earlier, that you knew about the allegations from Barbara Ramjan that Tony Abbott punched the wall back in student politics days. That this was, she's now suggested, part of a Labor operation to attack Tony Abbott. Did you know about it?
Oh, absolutely, I knew about it, and because I didn't say anything about it, I think that gives the lie to what Julie Bishop was saying. I've known Barbara
Ramjan. Didn't say anything to David Marr or anyone else associated with this story?
No, not at all, and I think David Marr will confirm that as well. But I did know about it, and it was several years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, that she told me about it. And I've known Barbara for 20 years or more, and it was in the general discussion about Tony Abbott and his days at Sydney University that it came up, and the account that she gave was pretty much verbatim what she told me. So the reason I made that comment publicly yesterday was that Liberals around the place were doubting the honesty of her statement. Well, she's made that statement a long time ago privately, and she's made it publicly, and I think there are a lot more people who have heard the story, and there were witnesses to it as well.
All right, we're going to have to wrap it up on that point. Bruce, Hawker, Grahame Morris, thank you both. We'll catch up next week.